prostitution are an invisible group of women that face violence and abuse. And it's with that in mind that I decided actually to dedicate my report this year to the issue of prostitution and violence against women and girls, A, because they are invisible, but B, because there is such a huge misunderstanding and also deliberate manipulation of what prostitution is. And therefore I wanted to unpack this issue and the link to violence against women and girls from a human rights perspective in order to address some of these deliberate manipulations of the concept and also to show the clear link to violence. So in a nutshell, in my report, I find that prostitution is a system of exploitation and violence that is perpetrated mainly, actually almost exclusively, by males against the majority of women and girls, so females. This system has three actors. One is the individuals that perpetrate this violence, which, as I said, are usually men and boys, those that buy sexual acts, those that are prostituted, which are predominantly women and girls, and then you have the third parties who organize or profit or benefit from prostituting women and girls. I call it a system of violence because that is what it is actually. Women in prostitution are subjected to atrocious human rights violations. They are robbed of their dignity, and they are often subjected to acts that fall no less than being acts of torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. They are subjected to physical forms of violence, mainly by the sex act buyers, including sexual abuse, including rape, gang rape, severe beatings, kidnapping, abduction, enforced disappearance, mutilation, burning. They also have objects inserted into them. They are urinated on, they are defecated on, they are ejaculated on, and they are forced into unprotected sex. Many of these acts result in long-lasting, lifelong-lasting harm. It can result in disability, it can result in severe psychological trauma, and it can also lead to femicide or killings. I took time to describe some of these acts because I think the majority of the public either is not aware of it or doesn't give it enough thoughts. In my report, I deliberately actually describe pornography as part of prostitution, so they are not two separate things. Pornography is filmed prostitution and shares all the characteristics of abuse and exploitation as physical prostitution. So given what I've just explained to you, I actually reject also then the terms that are used often by the public or by the media to describe prostitution, which is sex work. As I've just explained, this is not, prostitution doesn't involve sex because it's sexual acts, and it is not work. This is not dignified work. This doesn't meet the international standards, neither of work nor dignified work. And these terms, sex work, are used deliberately with an attempt to sanitize prostitution, to normalize it and to normalize the harm that happens in it. Also, I'd like to say that sex work is not an internationally agreed on language or terminology. Prostitution is the word that you would find in international treaties to talk about this issue, and it reflects really the terminology that states use. It's also very important not to use sex work as terminology, because of course by using sex work we are suggesting that women choose to be engaged in prostitution, they are consenting to it, and of course that's also the other narrative that often surrounds prostitution, is that women want to do this, they find it empowering, they found it dignified, and this could be nothing further from the truth. In fact, as I show in my report, international law states that you cannot consent as a human to situations that are exploitative and abusive. So therefore, in prostitution, women cannot be consenting to a system that violates all aspects of their human right. And the fact that there is a transaction or money involved is actually the biggest proof that this is not consensual. Because as many women in prostitution have told us, they consider this paid rape. And without the transaction, the overwhelming majority of women wouldn't have entered or wouldn't have been trapped in prostitution. I know that Ilaria alluded to the issue of trauma and dissociation, but that is also a relevant concept here, because of course, by saying that women consent to being prostituted, it ignores what we know about trauma and how trauma works. It ignores the fact that women in prostitution develop strong trauma-based emotional attachment or trauma bonding to their pimps and abusers who control all aspects of their life. And also through this trauma, their perception as victims is altered, and their understanding also of the perpetrator's thinking is changed, as well as they act in ways to ensure their survival, literally their survival on a day-to-day basis. In the report, I explain also very briefly what allows the system of prostitution to prosper and to continue. You have, of course, the patriarchy, which is at the base of this, normalizing the fact that one sex or one gender can buy another. And it has become exacerbated by the globalization that we see, where everything, including women's sexual and reproductive abilities, are commodified and are sold and bought. And it is also being exacerbated by the widespread and increasing economic inequalities we see, including between men and women, increased poverty of women and girls, conflict, increased militarization, legacies of colonialism, war, all that resulting also in the forced displacement of women and girls. And also it's very clear therefore, given that what I said, that there are certain groups of women and girls that are more exposed to the risk of prostitution and being trapped in prostitution, such as women that come from groups that are already facing discrimination and marginalization, so women that are discriminated against because of their race, because perhaps they belong to an ethnic or religious minority that faces discrimination, women fleeing conflicts, women fleeing poorer societies. So therefore, it's not a surprise that in many countries, the vast majority of women and girls in prostitution are either indigenous women, are, for example, in some European countries, they could be Roma women. They come from East European countries that are ravaged by war, like the Ukraine, or that are poorer, like further impoverished, or where the situation economically is worse, like Romania, for example, or that are also ravaged by conflict in Africa, like Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So that brings us back to the point that if prostitution was really just work, like any other work, why are women fleeing conflict and poverty overwhelmingly represented in prostitution? Why don't we find more local white women, upper class, that also are in prostitution? So I've also alluded to the issue of pornography and the very harmful impact of pornography, and the way also it really negatively shapes the sexual expectations of men and boys, and also the expectation of women and girls of what they should provide, how they are valued in society. So it also leads all society to commodify and sexualize women, and to commodify and sexualize and pornify girls. So girls in particular feel the weight of this sexualization on them because of the normalization of pornography, because of the vast, extreme consumption of pornography, which is also very violent. This creates the expectation they have of themselves that it is normal to be subjected to violence, it is normal to expect sexual acts of them all the time, and it's normal to be also paid for that. And that is why it is very, very disturbing, actually, that also with the increased access of adolescents to pornography, which is becoming more and more violent, we see an increase in violent sexual acts being perpetrated, not only on women, but also on girls. In a number of Western countries, we are seeing the increase in rape and gang rape, including by adolescent 14-year-olds of their peers. We see also very harmful, violent acts being perpetrated on women of all ages, like strangulations and other extreme acts. And this is very concerning because states actually are not coming to grips with this violence, are not adopting legislation and policies in order to stem this tide of violence. In the report, I also speak very briefly about the different models that states have adopted in order to respond or deal with prostitution. I'm not going to go into the details here, but suffice to say that after a review of all the models that are out there, I firmly believe that the best model to deal with prostitution and to deal with the underlying causes of prostitution is really the Nordic model, otherwise known as the abolitionist model or the equality model. And that's because it offers really a comprehensive way of approaching the issue of prostitution that is both human rights centered, but also, as I said, that tries to work at the origins, which is the normalization of buying sexual acts. So how does it do that? Through the 5 components that it adopts. 1, it looks at women and children or girls in prostitution as victims. So irrespective of when and how law enforcement or authorities come across women in prostitution, they are victims, they should not be criminalized, they should not be penalized, and they have a right, therefore, to assistance and protection. The second component is that it very clearly criminalizes the purchase of sexual acts in order to make it more difficult for men and boys thinking of buying women and girls to actually engage in something like this. It says this is not normal, and therefore it is criminalized, and therefore it also can impose fines on buyers of sexual acts, all with the purpose of discouraging the buying of sexual acts. Of course, therefore, it also criminalizes pimping, and it implements sensitization and education campaigns with a clear objective of abolishing the buying of sexual acts. The 5th component is also a very important component and not sufficiently adopted, including in countries that have the Nordic model, which is that it provides exit strategies to women in prostitution through comprehensive support in order to deal with the trauma, the psychological trauma, but also the physical illnesses and problems that they have developed as a result of this abuse, but also in order to be able to find housing, to stabilize their lives, and to find alternatives. So this is also a very clear recommendation. I would like to say that, and maybe I'll conclude here, that irrespective of where countries are with regards to prostitution, irrespective of the models that they have adopted, there are actions that all states and all authorities can take today, even if they still do not recognize prostitution as an issue. One is to invite and platform victims and survivors. I don't think anyone does that enough. I'm very happy to see Rachel here with us today. We must listen to survivors, we must listen to women that have these experiences, and not to marginalize them in favor of what is the quote-unquote sex work lobby that tries to platform, basically advocates for the legalization of sort of the normalization and legalization of prostitution as just sex work, and to provide more exit strategies, and to provide also support to frontline organizations that deal with victims. So these are some of the things that I think today can be adopted, and that states have to really also allocate resources for. I will conclude by saying that there are states that are very deliberately promoting the normalization of prostitution as sex work, because of course it takes money and resources to support the most vulnerable women left behind, those that are being abused. So if you advocate for a model that says, but you can get out of your poverty by doing sex work, then it lifts the responsibility from the shoulders of the state. It actually means the state isn't responsible. It doesn't have to do anything on that, about that. And it shifts the onus to the women in prostitution to help themselves. Only, of course, they get more embroiled in a web of abuse and exploitation. And the second thing is, by normalizing prostitution as sex work, any abuse you sustain as a woman in prostitution or as a victim becomes an employment-related issue. So it also then waters down the abuse, and it waters down the ability of women also to seek justice, to be able to seek support, and to hold pimps and abusers accountable. I will stop there.